Hi folks, my name's Merlin and this is Get Started. So welcome to Get Started, the series where I teach you the ins and outs of Warhammer 40,000. Last episode we built our first models, but currently they're looking a little on the grey side. So in this episode we're going to rectify that by putting paint to model. We'll be focusing on the Tyranids first of all, as we're still working on our Space Marine Captain. So for this series, I'm going to be using the colour scheme of High Fleet Leviathan, which is the colours you see on the front and back of the box. So in order to get us started, we first need to prime our models. In order to do that, I recommend using an aerosol primer, or if you have it, an airbrush primer. I've used Colourforge's Whitebone as my primer. It's a nice bright off-white, which is perfect for the starting point of our Tyranids. You will of course need paintbrushes, water pot and a palette, as well as your paints. I'll put a list of the paints I'm using up here in the corner of the screen. Whatever brushes you use is entirely up to you. I have my personal favourites from a local hobby shop, and I've also got a wet palette from Army Painter. For the water pot, I'm just using an empty jam jar, but you're free to use whatever container you have to hand. So some key important tips for when it comes to painting. When using an aerosol or primer, seek adult supervision and make sure you are wearing a face mask, protective goggles, and some old clothes and latex gloves just in case of overspill. You'll also want to spray in a well-ventilated area, preferably outside. Finally, when doing any type of painting, it's always best to work in a well-lit, well-ventilated area and take plenty of breaks in between your colours, letting them fully dry and also giving yourself a little bit of a breather. So with that introduction out of the way, let's hop over to the table and we'll start painting our Tyranid Psychophage. So here we are with our Psychophage ready to be painted. As you can see, I've undercoated it with the Whitebone, but we've got some areas, notably here and underneath here, where the primer hasn't quite reached. You'll also notice I've masked off the areas that contact the base with some blue tack. And speaking of the base, we can set it off to one side for the moment. So, our first colour, in order to get the base layer fully solidified, is Wraithbone from Citadel. So I'll just get a small amount of this on the palette, add a touch of water, smoothing it out, and then we can apply it to our model. I'm using quite a large brush. I've got a size 10 flat from Royal and Langnickel here. Gives us plenty of area coverage. Wraithbone is a little darker than the base cover of Whitebone, but it doesn't matter, as we hope we're going to get a solid coat all over with this. Good idea to paint it one half at a time, just so you have something to be able to hold on to. With our Wraithbone dry, ready to move on to our next colour. So we're going to paint all the carapace areas as well as the claws with Grey Sear. So this is another contrast base paint, so perfect for all the darker areas of the model. So we'll do just like before. We'll get a small amount on our palette and thin it down with just a touch of water. I'm using a size 3 from Royal and Langnickel this time. We got a nice rounded tip there, so added control. So we're going to paint the carapace here, being careful when we get near that Wraithbone that we've just painted. We may need a couple of layers of this over the Wraithbone, as it might show through once dry. But if you do, give it another coat once the first has fully dried. And like I said, we'll also pick out the claws ready for the red. and the carapace here on the leg as well. With the gracie now fully dried, our model is ready to have some actual colours put onto it. So the first thing you want to do is to give the model an all over shade, and what we're going to be using is Carabird Crimson, but we're going to be filling it down with Lamy Medium. So the ratio we want is 1 drop of Carabird Crimson to 3 drops of Lamy Medium to make a nice thinned out wash, just to help tone down the skin. So for this, I do recommend we paint it in stages. So we'll focus first of all on the front half of the model. So we'll start working the Carabird Crimson over our model. I'm using a large shade brush from Citadel here. And just want to work it into all the recesses, every nook and cranny you can find, including the inside of the mouth. Once the front end is dry, we can apply the same to the rear half as well. You want to make sure you keep moving the wash around and avoid any pooling. So if you see where the wash is getting too much, just use your brush to move it around. As you can see, our Carabird Crimson has dried quite nicely, giving a nice recess shade all over the model. But now we got to try and bring it back up to a more flesh colour. So we're going to use Flayed on Flesh, and the method we're using is called dry brushing. So this is where we take paint on a brush, but we work it into the brush off onto a piece of tissue. I've got a bit of kitchen roll here. And what we do, we work the paint into the bristles like so. Crisscrosses, circles, getting as much of the pigment off as possible. Moving over to a clear area, still a little too strong. There, that's about right, just there. Then we're going to focus this all over the fleshy areas. So using our brush, we'll do circle motions, allowing the paint to be picked up by the larger raised areas, leaving that shade in the recess. Work your way around the entire model, picking out all the fleshy areas. Don't matter if you get any on the carapace, we'll be covering that up in the next step. There we go, with the flesh dry brushed, we're ready to move on to the carapace. So the colour we'll be using is Luxian Purple. This is a really vibrant purple, and I think it works well for the Tyranids of High Fleet Leviathan. It might seem bright at first, but once we build up a couple of layers, it will really bring our models to life. So we'll be using the same size 3 brush as earlier for added control. This is a contrast paint, so it's treated much like a wash, but it will give us a highlight as well when it dries. So what we're going to do, we're going to paint this all over the areas that are carapace. We'll try to avoid these little vents, as we want to keep those Carabird Crimson shade. once the first layer of this is dried, we'll go back in and we'll do a second layer just to give a nice solid coat. With the Luxian purple drying, we're going to move on to some of the other details. So we're going to use Fire Slayer Flesh. This is for the tentacles, the inside of the mouth, and all the joints on its limbs. So again, we'll be using the size 3 brush. We'll get a puddle of this contrast paint onto our palette. Clean off our brush. Then we can load up. So the areas we're looking for are these sections here. And here. And we're going to do the entire tentacled maw, even right up underneath here. So, giving a nice solid coat of the Fire Slayer Flesh. No need to be neat around the base detail. We'll come back to them in a later video. And with the Fire Slayer Flesh applied, our Tyranids are getting pretty close to completion. So let's move on to the next colour. So moving on, our next colour is going to be Flesh Terror's Red. So this is going to be used for the tongue inside his mouth and all his claws. So again, the size 3 brush, as we need a large brush but still plenty of control. We'll use our palette just to get a small puddle of the paint, and then we can apply it. So we'll start here on this claw, get a nice solid layer of the Flesh Terror's Red. Same for the large claw on the end of his leg here. Avoiding any of the areas we've painted with the Fire Slayer Flesh. Now, of course, reaching inside his mouth, we'll get his tongue. And we can use this to paint the Blood Angel arm that he is devouring. Ready for when we paint our Blood Angel details in a future video. While the claws are drying, we're going to return to the skin. And we're going to use a small layer brush and some neat Caribou Crimson, and we're just going to run it into all the small vents along the flesh of our model. So making sure we don't have too much on the brush so that we overspill. We just want to run Caribou Crimson into those gaps like so. Same for the ones up here on the chimneys, we'll get those as well. With that contrast dry, we're going to move on to a new detail. So we're going to look at the fumes coming out of its dorsal chimneys, and to start things off we're going to need a nice smooth layer of Corax White. So it might take 2, but I think we can get away with probably 1. We'll use our size 3 brush again. Nice chunky brush for the area. And we'll pick out all this toxic fume with the Corax White. Being careful where we meet the purple, of course. With the white dry, we're going to now shade all over with a mix of Coelia green shade and Lamy medium in a 1:2 mix, and this will give the smoke a nice dusky green toxic appearance. While waiting for the shade to finish drying, we're going to start picking out our final few details, and we're going to start with the teeth. So we're going to use a shabby bone here, and we're just going to be picking out the larger teeth. So the ones along its top jaw and the two that are down here on its bottom jaw. So we're using a small layer brush, just picking out the raised points of the teeth. And down here we'll pick out these larger fangs on the bottom jaw. And also making sure we haven't got too much on the brush, a nice thin tip. We'll pick out the eyes, ready for our next colour. And our next colour is just on the eyes. We're going to use Iandan yellow to give them a nice yellowy glow. Again, we use our small layer brush for added control. Just want a small dot of paint on the tip of our brush, and we'll work it into the eyes. Like so. And our final colour is going back to Corax White. We're going to use this in two ways. We're going to use it as a dry brush over the plumes of smoke, and we'll also use it to paint all the masonry rocks on the base, and then we're done. So for the base detail, we'll look at the one here on his leg. Try to avoid the Tyranid growth, and we'll just paint the stone. And then in the same way we did the flesh earlier, we're going to dry brush just the ends with Corax White. So it goes from a dark base to a light tip. And there we go. That's the Psychophage painted up using very simple techniques. In future videos, we'll come back to this model and we'll add extra details once we learn some new tips and tricks when we get to character models. We'll also be having a special all about how to base your models in a future video. There'll be a couple of different schemes I'll be showing, so we'll come back to basing this guy later on. Congratulations, you've just painted your first model, the fearsome Tyranid Psychophage. In this video we used simple paint techniques in order to get our model up to a battle-ready tabletop standard with a nice pleasing result. We'll be coming back to this model in a future video to add some extra details, including base work and even some highlights. So up next then is our first special episode, which we're going to be looking at converting and kit bashing. For that we're going to turn our Terminator Captain into a bit more of a Blood Angel. For that video, we're going to try and recreate the classic Blood Angels character, Captain Carlane of the Archangels, the First Company. So, join me for that very special episode. If you want to follow along with it, I'll put a list of components that you will require in a post on my YouTube channel. If you don't want to do the conversions, feel free to skip ahead to the next video in the series, which will be looking at painting Blood Angels as we turn our attention to painting the Blood Angel Terminator Captain. Either way, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Thank you all very much for watching. And until next time, stay safe and happy hobbying. Goodbye.